It's a family gathering, and you dare serve bad food.
Just after taking a bite of the meal, George flipped the dish on the table, letting his angry voice fill the room. All the gathered relatives looked at him in shock, having never seen someone throw food on the floor like that. They must all feel the same way. Hey, what are you doing?
It's your fault for making bad food. Being a housewife and still making such sloppy meals at a time like this? Who could eat this stuff?
He snorted derisively. I looked at him with pity and said, I didn't make it, though.
What?
Frozen in place with a foolish expression, George had his moment of vulnerability. Now was the time. This was my chance to fight back after being oppressed for so long. I took a deep breath and calmed myself. My name is Lucy Brown, 32 years old. Until a year ago, I worked for a condominium management company, but quit my job upon getting married. And now, I'm a full-time housewife. George had strongly suggested that I quit my job because he wanted a housewife. I complied with his request and left my job. Truth be told, I would have liked to work a little longer, but considering George's income, I thought we could live comfortably without me having to work. George works at a major consulting firm. We met through work, and as we worked together, our relationship turned romantic and led to marriage. George had been with various consulting firms right after graduating from university. He was competent and articulate, which impressed me during our work interactions, prompting me to make the first move. I never thought someone like him would reciprocate my feelings, but he did, to my surprise. I was so happy that I bragged to my friends about our relationship. My friends might have been bemused, but I genuinely believed I was at the peak of happiness. When we decided to get married after a little over a year of dating, I was completely over the moon, unaware of the calamities that awaited.
You know, I'm busy with work on weekdays, so I'll only be coming home on weekends. Hope that's okay with you?
The night we submitted our marriage registration at the city hall, George casually mentioned this while watching TV in the living room. I was taken aback by his words, having imagined a blissful married life ahead. What do you mean?
I mean, I'll only come home on weekends. It'll help keep the feeling we had when we were still dating, right?
Well, but...
What, you have a problem with that?
No, not at all. His sudden proposal left me genuinely bewildered. Coming home only on weekends? Isn't that like a weekend marriage? It's strange to decide such a significant thing alone without discussing it first. If he really wanted a weekend marriage, he should have mentioned it before we got married, not suddenly declare it on the day we registered our marriage. Sure, seeing each other less might keep the excitement alive, but isn't it natural to want to be with the person you love all the time? The start of our married life was not as I had hoped, leaving me more disheartened than I expected. Perhaps out of concern for me or to appease me, George was unusually kind to me that day. The night brought our first intimate encounter as a married couple, which momentarily pushed the reality of our weekend marriage out of my mind. Maybe it was a strategic win for George. In hindsight, that declaration by George was just the beginning. I had no idea that what lay ahead would be much more challenging than a weekend marriage announced after the fact. 2 months into our marriage, George only came home on the weekends, just as he had declared. Although I wanted to welcome my tired husband back with a homemade dinner every day, my enthusiasm quickly waned. Even when he did come home on the weekends, he would often eat out, barely touching the meals I prepared. I had been subtly suggesting we end the weekend marriage, but George would overpower my opinion with comments like, "Huh? For a housewife, you sure dare to defy me," as if he was the most important person in the house. Indeed, I am a housewife, but that was George's wish. I now understood that he had me quit my job so he could have his way with the household, making me economically dependent on him and unable to oppose his commands. This must have been his intention all along. At night, I lay in bed, tears of frustration streaming down my face. How did it come to this? I just wanted a happy marriage. But it's too late for regrets. I have no choice but to wait patiently for George to change his mind. I felt like I was thrown into a tunnel with no way out, filled with anxiety. As our marriage entered its 3rd month, George started to come home only occasionally, even on weekends. This wasn't the agreement. What's the point of being married if we hardly see each other? Can we talk about our life together again? I mustered the courage to ask him again on a Friday night. George smelled of alcohol as if he had been out drinking, and there was also a sweet scent like osmanthus lingering on him. A shock went through me. No, it couldn't be.
I've told you over and over, I have no intention of changing anything now.
Even drunk, George persisted with his stance. But it's different from what we agreed on. You said we'd spend the weekends together. What about now? You're hardly home even on weekends. I never agreed to this. As I said this, George's face turned red with anger. I could tell I had upset him.
How many times do I have to say it? I won't budge. Seriously, why do you always complain? Maybe you should recognize your place.
George's attitude had changed drastically from before we were married. He no longer seemed to care about me. Why did he even marry me? Overwhelmed, I quickly retreated to my room. When I heard George go into the bathroom, I crept out of my room and into his, not wanting to, but unable to bear being at a disadvantage any longer. Desperate, I searched his room for certain evidence. Months passed, with us practically living separate lives. I stopped confronting George about not coming home, as something else had become a more pressing concern. I decided to live quietly for the time being. Then one day, I received a call on my mobile phone. It was my mother-in-law. I hadn't seen her since the marriage introduction. Wondering what she wanted, I picked up the phone. Hello?
Oh, Lucy, it's me.
Hello, mother-in-law. What's going on? It sounded like she was at the supermarket, with noisy chatter in the background.
It's almost Christmas. You're coming to our place for the holiday, right? All the relatives will be gathering, and we'd like you to join us.
Ah, about Christmas. Yes, I'd love to come. More importantly, mother-in-law. I decided to ask my mother-in-law if she knew anything about George, suspecting she might have some information. Have you talked to George recently?
George? Oh yes, we've talked several times. He finally got married, so I've been reaching out a lot, worried about how things are going. He says married life is going well.
What? I was puzzled by what my mother-in-law said. Married life is going well? Is that what George told his mother? Where in our weekend marriage is it going well? But then it hit me. George is deliberately lying to his mother, saying our marriage is smooth sailing. My mother-in-law is the type to worry about her son a lot. To put it nicely, she's caring, and to put it negatively, she's overprotective. I've only met her once, but it was clear from our first meeting how much she dotes on her son. Excuse me, but I think everything George has told you might be a lie. Actually, I told my mother-in-law about how George declared from the beginning of our marriage that he would only come home on weekends, and how recently there have been more days where we don't even see each other on weekends.
What are you talking about, Lucy? There's no way George would do something like that. Are you trying to deceive me by lying?
Who do you think you are? My confession made my mother-in-law very angry, and she raised her voice over the phone. I sighed, thinking as expected. This woman only believes what George says. She wouldn't doubt his words. If anyone speaks ill of George, even if it's his wife, she'll attack them relentlessly. That's her way. I'm not lying. If you're concerned, I can show you a month's worth of video from inside our house. Angered by being made out to be the villain despite suffering because of George, I offered this to my mother-in-law, but she refused, saying,
I don't need you to do something so shameful. You're the worst kind of wife,
before hanging up. I had a feeling it would come to this. I don't know what my father-in-law thinks of me since he's a man of few words, but my mother-in-law probably sees me just as a convenient marriage partner for George. Knowing this, I felt tired of continuing my married life with George as it was, and started to put into motion a plan I had been contemplating for a while. The day of action was set for Christmas, when George's family would gather at his house. I didn't know what would happen, but I was prepared to do as much as I could. I quietly steeled myself. As Christmas arrived, I went to George's parents' house as promised. Before leaving our house, I had contacted a certain person. Unaware of anything, George complained.
Man, going to the parents' house is such a drag.
As he reluctantly got ready. Upon arriving at George's parents' house, his parents, uncles, aunts, and cousins were all gathered. There was also a woman, presumably a maid, preparing food in the kitchen. She wore glasses and a mask, and naturally she didn't participate in our conversation, just quietly doing her job. With so many people around, it was hard to keep track of who was who.
Welcome, Lucy.
After our last phone call, she seemed to have lost all trust in me. While her words were welcoming, her eyes were not smiling. I forced a smile and said, "Happy Christmas." After that, I didn't speak much with my mother-in-law as the meal preparation continued. I also helped out in the kitchen. My father-in-law was as silent as ever, sitting on the sofa reading the newspaper. Once the meal was ready and I had finished serving, everyone began to eat. I saw George picking up a dish with simmered food. Just as I was about to reach for the rice because I was hungry, George exclaimed,
"It's a family gathering, and you dare serve bad food?"
There was a dull sound of ceramics hitting the floor, causing everyone to jump. George had flipped his dish along with the food on the table, his angry voice echoing throughout the room. All the gathered relatives looked at George in shock. Never before had they seen someone throw food on the floor. Surely they all felt the same way. "Hey, what are you doing?"
It's your fault for making bad food? Being a housewife and still making such sloppy meals at a time like this? Who could eat this stuff?
He snorted derisively. I looked at him with pity and said, "I didn't make it, though."
What?
Frozen in place with a foolish expression, George had his moment of vulnerability. Now was the time. This was my chance to fight back after being oppressed for so long. I took a deep breath and calmed myself.
What are you talking about? You were in the kitchen preparing the meal just a minute ago.
George laughed through his nose, looking at me with a face that said,
That makes no sense.
True, I was in the kitchen, but the housekeeper was there too. I was only preparing the dishes. The housekeeper made the food, right? I glanced at the housekeeper, who was supposed to be resting in the back room but had since come out, causing a stir among the relatives. Yes, that's correct. See, by the way, this housekeeper, I invited her. Let me introduce her. She's my mother. The housekeeper, no, my mother, removed her glasses and mask. Seeing her face, George and my in-laws were shocked. Since my in-laws and George knew my mother's face, they were surprised to see her here.
You weren't the housekeeper George hired?
I didn't know anything about this. I didn't arrange for any housekeeper.
It seemed my mother-in-law thought George had arranged for the housekeeper and was trembling with confusion. Hey, George, you know what my mother does for a living, right? She works at a fine dining restaurant and cooks delicious meals every day, but today she made the food lightly seasoned for the family. I wonder why you thought I made the food.
Because you were in the kitchen until just now.
George raised his voice, irritated by my question. Objectively, it might seem natural to assume I was involved in cooking since I was in the kitchen with my mother. But what George doesn't know is that the food I make is not lightly seasoned like what my mother prepared today. I prefer strong flavors, using plenty of salt and pepper. That's true, but the main reason you thought I made the food is because you hardly ever eat what I cook. George was left speechless.
What do you mean?
Everyone else in the room, not understanding the situation, widened their eyes. George turned pale and froze. I decided it was time to spill all of George's dishonest behaviors right there and then. On the day we registered our marriage, George told me, I won't come home on weekdays. We will only spend weekends together. It was a so-called weekend marriage. He never mentioned anything like this before we got married. I was shocked. I couldn't accept it, but whenever I tried to oppose or discuss it, he would just insist. A housewife like you shouldn't oppose me, and never listened to my opinions. The truth about our marital life coming to light one after another left the relatives in shock. Especially my mother-in-law barked with a face that screamed,
Not another lie. That can't be. Are you still saying such things? George always reports that you two are living happily together. Don't say such embarrassing things in front of the relatives.
Watching my mother-in-law fiercely defend her son in his stead, I sighed. It was almost time. Perhaps it was time to reveal that. Just as I was about to make up my mind and clenched my hands,
George, are you here?
a stranger woman's voice came from the entrance, causing the relatives to flinch collectively. As one of the relatives said,
What's this?
the door to the living room opened and a woman peeked her head in. She was about 20 years old, wearing a short skirt with bright red nails and glossy hair. After looking around at the many people inside the living room, she widened her eyes and said in a puzzled voice,
Huh? George, what's all this about?
She called out to George in a flirtatious voice, looking around in confusion. It seemed everyone except me couldn't comprehend the situation.
Kathy, why are you here?
George's supposed affair partner, Kathy, twisted her neck in more confusion at George's surprised reaction.
Why? You invited me. You said you wanted to introduce me to your family because we're getting married.
What? When did I ever say that?
When? Look, 2 weeks ago.
As she showed the message exchange with George, he was taken aback.
I didn't send this.
Then who did?
Standing in front of the arguing pair, I stepped forward. Nice to meet you. I'm George's wife. I was the one who invited you here today. Sorry, George, but I sent the message without your permission.
What?
Both of them were left speechless. Indeed, since the day my mother-in-law invited me for Christmas, I have been plotting to get back at George. 2 weeks ago, while George was taking a bath late at night, I sneakily left the bedroom and took his smartphone. It was clear that he was frequently messaging Kathy, indicating she was his affair partner. I lied to bring her here today to catch them in the act. The relatives started murmuring upon hearing our exchange. My in-laws' faces turned pale. I had been suspicious. Why did George start a lifestyle of only coming home on weekends right after we got married? A weekend marriage means we barely see each other, even though we're married. I wondered if he really loved me. Would he choose to live like this?
That's because I'm busy with work. I've told you many times.
Still trying to resist the situation, George. I sighed deeply in frustration. Work? Yes, I believed that at first. But then I noticed the perfume smell when you came home at night, and I started to suspect, so I hired a detective.
What? Wait, investigation?
George trembled suddenly. I pulled out the detective agency's infidelity investigation report from my bag and presented it to George and Kathy. I had commissioned the investigation a while back. The evidence of infidelity was quickly found, allowing me to gather a significant amount of proof. You started dating 5 years ago when Kathy was only 15. You picked her up on the street and began dating. Of course, you couldn't marry a child like Kathy. Plus, Kathy works in nightlife now. It's unlikely her parents would approve. But feeling pressured by your parents to get married, you settled for a safe option like me. Once they stopped nagging, you continued your relationship with Kathy, planning to leave me for her eventually under the guise of being busy at work. I combined the information from the detective agency's report with the content of the messages exchanged between George and Kathy, revealing their deceit.
What are you saying? George wouldn't do such a thing.
Despite my mother-in-law's initial attempt to defend George, she was unable to argue against the evidence laid before her, and dropped her shoulders in defeat. George and Kathy looked at each other, shaking. Eventually, George broke the silence.
You're being underhanded, using such tactics to disgrace us. What you're doing is filthy.
Hearing those words, I felt a rage so intense it felt like my blood vessels might burst, and I shouted, Underhanded? What are you talking about? The one being underhanded is you, who stopped coming home right after we got married. Approaching me while having someone else, using me and then blaming me while excusing yourself? Were you waiting for me to grow tired of you and bring up divorce? Well, too bad for you. Of course we will divorce, but you will be paying a substantial amount in compensation, and that goes for your affair partner as well. I glared at George and Kathy, giving them the scariest look I've ever given anyone.
What? Why me? I don't have any money.
Please forgive me. It was my fault. But please, not the compensation.
I glared at the two of them again and shouted, "Just get out, now!" Upon hearing my shout, George and Kathy finally screamed and ran out of the house. Everyone, I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience. As I stepped back and composed myself, sighs escaped from among the relatives. They were all appalled by George's actions, seemingly at a loss for words.
Lucy, I don't know what to say.
Having trusted George and slandered me, my mother-in-law looked down awkwardly. My mother, who had been pretending to be a housekeeper, and I then left my in-laws' house. It's likely I will never visit this house again. Thus, my troubled one-year marriage to George came to an end. A few days later, I had George sign the divorce papers and submitted them to the city office. Now, I am officially single again. Although I now have a divorce record, our marriage was so brief and hardly a marriage at all, so it didn't feel much different. Since George and I lived in a rental apartment, I managed to get him to move out without much trouble. Afterward, George did pay the compensation he owed me, but without any savings, he had to ask relatives for money. Despite working for an elite company, he was broke because he had squandered his money on expensive gifts for women. However, the relatives who had witnessed the Christmas debacle were, of course, not inclined to lend George any money. He had no choice but to take out a bank loan. Kathy also took out a loan to pay her share of the compensation. With both of them now starting their journey of loan repayment, their marriage has been postponed. At least until they pay off their debts, both sets of parents agree they should not marry. My in-laws must be fed up with getting involved in troublesome matters. Let them struggle with the loan repayments. Compared to the year of suffering I endured, having to work hard to pay off a debt must seem easy, I thought, almost as if it were someone else's problem. Meanwhile, I have returned to my previous job at a condominium management company and am enjoying my work. It's much better for my mental health than staying cooped up at home. If I ever decide to marry again, I silently vow to marry someone who is okay with both of us working.